January 20th, 1993, to Lochenaz, Switzerland. The village has not yet woken up. La Paisible, the peaceful one, sits behind a low stone wall on the edge of town, surrounded by the kind of garden that takes decades to grow right. Inside, the house is quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when someone has stopped fighting. Audrey Hepburn died that morning, just after 6 a.m., with Robert Walders beside her and both of her sons nearby. She was 63 years old. The cancer had moved fast, the way her doctors had warned it would. She had known since November. Sean was 32, Luca was 22. Between the two of them, they had lived through 2 of their mother's marriages, 2 divorces, at least a dozen moves across 2 continents, a handful of film sets, several schools neither of them chose, and the particular experience, impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't had it, of growing up as the private child of the most photographed woman on earth. They were not strangers to loss. Audrey had made sure of that, in ways she intended and ways she never meant to. This is not a story about Audrey Hepburn the actress. That story has been told. It has been told in retrospectives and coffee table books and anniversary screenings and the kind of magazine profiles that describe cheekbones as if they were a moral achievement. This is the story of what it cost to be raised by her, what it felt like to be someone she loved completely, and occasionally, in the way of very famous people, forgot. What Sean carried out of that house into a career spent managing his mother's ghost. What Luca built in Rome, quietly, behind a life that most people have never thought to ask about. 2 boys, 1 map, then none. To understand either of them, you first have to understand the world they were born into. Not the world of Givenchy gowns and Cannes press lines, but the one behind it, the one with the moving boxes and the late nights and the parent who came home from the set smelling like someone else's story. Audrey Kathleen Ruston was born May 4th, 1929, in Ixelles, Belgium, to an Anglo-Irish banker and a Dutch baroness. The baroness is the important one. For our purposes, Ella van Heemstra was beautiful, remote, aristocratic, and almost entirely emotionally unavailable. She would remain a presence in Audrey's life, and then in her grandchildren's lives, well into old age. The template she set, the mother who loves you fiercely and withholds herself simultaneously, would repeat. The war intervened before Audrey was 10. Her father, Joseph Hepburn Ruston, left the family in 1935, a departure that wounded her in ways she would discuss carefully for the rest of her life. Never rawly, always with a light touch, always with the composure of someone who had learned very young that grief performed well was more socially acceptable than grief shown. When the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, she was in Arnhem with her mother. She watched executions. She gathered food during the hunger winter of 1944 to 45, surviving on tulip bulbs and bread made from grass. By the time she was 15, her body had been reshaped by malnutrition in ways no amount of later wealth would fully reverse. Anemia, respiratory problems, and a metabolism doctors described as permanently altered. She was thin not because she was fashionable, but because starvation had made her that way. And the fashion industry would spend the next 4 decades calling it a gift. She arrived in London after the war with nothing much except bone structure and extraordinary will. She was dancing in the back row of a West End chorus at 19, booking small television parts at 20, and playing Gigi on Broadway at 23. When William Wyler cast her in Roman Holiday in 1952, she was paid $12,500. Gregory Peck, her co-star, a decade older, considerably less interesting to watch, was paid $100,000. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress the following March. The same year, she won the Tony for Gigi, becoming the first performer to accomplish both in a single calendar year. She was 23 years old, and by every external measure, had already arrived somewhere most people never reach. The marriages came in 2 rounds. Mel Ferrer first, the actor and director she met during the run of Gigi, 12 years her senior, a man described by nearly everyone who knew them as either deeply devoted or controlling, depending on which side of the story you believed. They married in September 1954 in Bergenstock, Switzerland. She miscarried twice before Sean was born in July 1960 in Lucerne. The miscarriages were reported in the press with the same casual intimacy that her wardrobe choices were reported, a feature of celebrity life in that era that she found, by some accounts, genuinely difficult to absorb. She grieved privately and filmed publicly. That, too, was a template. The Ferrer marriage ended in 1968, when Sean was 8. The divorce was quiet by the standards of the time. No public statement, no contested accusations in the press. Audrey moved with Sean to Rome, and within a year fell into a relationship with Andrea Dotti, a 30-year-old Italian psychiatrist she had first met at a dinner party a decade earlier. They married in January 1969. Luca was born in February 1970 in Lausanne. The Dotti marriage was a different kind of story. Andrea was charming, well-connected, and constitutionally incapable of fidelity. The affairs were documented in the Italian press with a frequency and specificity that made them almost impossible for Audrey to pretend away. She tried anyway, for over a decade, moving between their Rome apartment and the house she had begun to love in Tolochenaz, attempting to maintain the stability of a household for Luca, the way she had never quite managed for Sean. The divorce was finalised in 1982. Luca was 12. By then, Sean had already passed through boarding school at Institut Le Rosey in Switzerland, had already learned what his father's distance and his mother's absences added up to, and had already begun the project, one neither son would have named it that way, of figuring out who he was when nobody was watching. What Audrey was as a mother is not a matter of dispute among the people who watched her do it. She was present in a way that surprised people who expected a star. She cooked, she drove carpool, she sat on the floor of La Paisible's kitchen well into the evening, supervising homework in the lamplight, making pasta the way she had learned in Rome. Sean has described mornings when she would appear at his bedroom door with elaborate breakfast trays. Not staff, her. She made us feel, he said in a 2003 interview accompanying the biography he wrote in her memory, that there was nothing more important in the world than what we needed. And yet, she was also gone, in the way that famous people are gone even when they are in the room. There were films to make and press obligations, and the specific gravity of being iconic in an era before that word lost all meaning. Sean would later describe arriving home from Le Rosey one school break to find the house staffed but empty. Audrey on location, a note on the kitchen table. The housekeeper instructed to provide whatever he needed. He was 14. He needed his mother. That was not something a housekeeper could provide. This is the inheritance both boys received before they received anything else. The certainty that they were loved, and the loneliness of being loved by someone the world would not stop borrowing. Sean Hepburn Ferrer was born on July 13, 1960, at the Clinique Cecil in Lucerne, Switzerland. Audrey was 31. She had been pregnant twice before and lost both. By the time Sean arrived, she had been living with that particular kind of grief for long enough that the joy of his birth carried its own complicated weight. The relief of it, the terror of how much she already needed him to be okay. Mel Ferrer was 42. Already directing, already in the process of becoming the kind of husband who is technically present and emotionally elsewhere. His relationship with Sean would take decades to settle into something resembling warmth. At the time of Sean's birth, Mel was between projects, financially dependent to a degree he found humiliating on his wife's salary, and by several accounts navigating that humiliation badly. Whether that manifested in control, coldness, or simple absence depends on who you ask. Sean, characteristically, has never said directly. He has described his father as complicated, in the way that adult children describe parents who hurt them and whom they've decided to forgive anyway. The first years of Sean's life moved like a film on fast forward. Audrey was making breakfast at Tiffany's in 1961 when Sean was less than a year old. Charade in 1963. My Fair Lady through 1963 and into early 1964. Between films, the family was in Tolochanas, or in Los Angeles, or in Rome, wherever the work required. Sean was cared for by a succession of nannies, who were, by all accounts, chosen carefully and replaced regularly. Audrey's standards for who stood between her son and the world were extremely high. He attended local schools when they were settled, English language schools when they weren't. By the time he was 6, he had lived on 3 continents and held a working understanding of 4 languages. Whether that is an advantage or a kind of dislocation that takes years to fully process is a question worth sitting with. The divorce came in 1968, when Sean was 8 years old. Audrey and Mel had been moving toward it for some time. The marriage had been eroding since at least 1965, when the gap between her star power and his career had become too wide to paper over with affection. The legal separation was arranged without public drama. Sean has said that he was told in the manner of a gentle weather report. This was happening, everything would be fine. His mother and father both loved him enormously. He accepted this because what else does an 8-year-old do? He moved with Audrey to Rome. Rome is where his childhood effectively became 2 separate lives. The one in his mother's apartment near the Villa Borghese, lively and warm and full of her careful domesticity, and the one that began the day Andrea Dotti walked in. Sean was 9 when Audrey and Dotti married. He was 22 when they divorced. Those 13 years are the years that shaped him most, and they are years he speaks of with a care that suggests he is still editing the story as he tells it. Dotti was charming to Sean. Most accounts suggest genuine warmth between stepfather and stepson, at least in the early years. But Dotti's infidelities were the kind that made newspapers, the kind that Audrey could not insulate her children from, no matter how much she tried. Sean was a teenager in Rome, watching his mother perform the dignity of a woman, pretending not to be humiliated. He watched her choose the marriage over her comfort, again and again, for reasons that were partly about Luca, and partly, he has suggested carefully, about her own childhood and the father who left. The pattern was legible even to a teenager, especially to a teenager. He enrolled at Institut La Rosey, the Swiss boarding school that has educated, among others, the Shah of Iran and the King of Belgium, and whose annual fees in the 1970s were sufficient to finance a small film, around 1974. He was 14. La Rosey operates on a schedule that moves students between 2 campuses: Roll on the lake in the autumn and spring, Gstaad in the mountains in winter. It is, by every description, a beautiful place to be educated and an efficient place to feel far from home. Sean has described it without visible resentment, which might mean it suited him, or might mean he made his peace with it long ago. He was a quiet student, not an unhappy one. He made friends who would remain part of his life. He developed a serious interest in film that would become his career. By the time he graduated and returned to work beside his mother, the shape of what Sean Ferrer was going to do with his life had begun to clarify. He worked as a production assistant, then as an assistant director, then in various producing capacities on projects that put him in proximity to the industry his mother had navigated with such extraordinary grace and such private cost. He was not trading on her name in the crass sense. He was genuinely learning the craft, putting in the unglamorous hours, but the name was always there, opening certain doors by existing. And Sean understood this the way a person understands a wind that has always blown in one direction. You don't resent it, you learn to navigate it. His producing career developed through the 1980s and into the 1990s, with work across American and European productions. He was building a life, finding his own footing in the industry on terms that were genuinely his. And then, in November 1992, his mother called him from Houston, where she had gone for surgery after the colon cancer diagnosis. And the map changed again. He flew to be with her. Both sons did. The surgery was not what anyone had hoped for. The cancer had spread in ways that made cure impossible, and made the question of time the only remaining question. Audrey chose to come home. Sean helped manage the logistics of that return, the medical equipment that needed to arrive before she did, the staff arrangements, the privacy measures. He has described those weeks with a precision that suggests he revisits them often. The quality of the winter light at La Paisible, the way the garden looked bare but ordered, the sound of the house at night. She died on January 20th, 1993. Sean was 32. What followed was a grief that was also immediately a duty. Audrey had not simply died, she had left behind an image, a legacy, a foundation, and a set of children's films she had been narrating for UNICEF. All of it needed someone to steward it with the seriousness it deserved. Sean assumed that role with a completeness that his brother, younger and differently oriented, would not. The Audrey Hepburn Children's Fund, which Audrey had been developing before her death, became Sean's primary project. He has served as its chairman and most visible advocate, travelling to the same kinds of places his mother had visited in her final years: Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, carrying her name into contexts where it meant something concrete, not cosmetic. He has been careful, always, to frame the work as continuation rather than memorial. The distinction matters to him. In 2003, he published Audrey Hepburn, An Elegant Spirit, a biography memoir hybrid that used photographs from the family archive alongside his own recollections to construct a portrait of his mother that was intimate without being confessional. The book sold well and was received with the warmth of something authentic, which it was. Sean had spent years watching other people describe his mother in terms that felt adjacent to the truth, but never quite inside it. Writing the book was, by his own account, the act of someone who needed to say, "I knew her." Not the icon, her. His personal life has been largely private, in a way that reads less like concealment than preference. He has been in a long relationship with Leila Sona, together for many years, based between Europe and the United States. His daughter Emma Ferrer, born in 1985, is the detail most people reach for when they want to complete the picture. Emma, who appeared on the cover of Harper's Bazaar in August 2014, photographed by Peter Lindbergh, wearing the kind of minimalist elegance that made the resemblance to her grandmother arresting. She has spoken about that shoot with a self-awareness that suggests she has thought carefully about the weight of genetic coincidence. "I'm not trying to be her," she told interviewers at the time. She wasn't. But the image existed anyway, and it moved people. And Sean, who understood better than anyone what it meant to live inside an image that belonged to someone else, watched it circulate with whatever private feeling a father has when the world briefly turns his daughter into a symbol. Emma did not continue in modelling as a primary career. She moved toward other work, other interests, a life built on terms that were deliberately her own. She has not made a career of being Audrey Hepburn's granddaughter, which is perhaps the most Hepburn thing about her. Sean Hepburn Ferrer is 64 years old. He lives between continents, carries his mother's foundation forward, and has spent 30 years being the one who remembers her in public so that the record doesn't drift entirely into myth. What it costs to do that work, to be simultaneously a son in grief and a curator of legacy, is not something he discusses directly, but it is there in the precision of the book. It is there in the measured way he answers questions about her. It is there in the fact that when he speaks about her, he always reaches for the specific detail over the general feeling. The breakfast tray, the kitchen floor, the lamplight. He remembers her in objects, in moments, in the particular. The way you remember someone, you are determined not to lose to abstraction. He never had a map for who to be without her. He made one. If Sean's story is one of public inheritance, the foundation, the book, the image carefully tended, then Luca Dotti's is something else entirely. It is the story of a man who watched his brother assume the role of keeper and chose, with apparent deliberateness, not to compete for it, who built a life in Rome that is domestic, professional, mostly private, and almost entirely his own, who wrote one book about his mother, one that almost nobody expected, and then stepped back into the life he had made before. Anyone was paying attention. Whether that is peace or distance or simply temperament is the question his story keeps asking. He has never fully answered it. That silence, in a family this visible, is its own kind of statement. Luca Dotti was born on February 8, 1970, at the Clinique de la Source in Lausanne, Switzerland. He was 10 years younger than his brother, the product of a different marriage, a different man, a different version of his mother. Audrey was 40 years old when she had him. She had been through the arc of her greatest fame: Roman Holiday, Sabrina, Funny Face, Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Fair Lady, and was entering a period of deliberate withdrawal from the industry that had consumed her 30s. She made fewer films after Luca was born. Whether that was choice or timing or the particular mathematics of a woman who had given the industry everything it asked for and was now quietly renegotiating the terms, she was more present for Luca in his early years than she had been able to be for Sean. The Rome apartment on the Via Appia Antica was the centre of his childhood. Andrea Dotti, his father, was a psychiatrist at the University of Rome. Handsome, socially magnetic, from a good family, the kind of man who seems in early photographs to be exactly the stability Audrey had been reaching for after the Ferrer years. Luca grew up in a household that had, by most accounts, the texture of normal Roman bourgeois life. School runs, Sunday lunches, the rhythms of a city that moves on its own terms regardless of who lives in it. His mother cooked. His mother was there. That part was real. What was also real, and harder, was the press. Andrea Dotti's affairs were not discreet. They were photographed, reported, discussed in Italian tabloids, with a frankness that Italian celebrity culture permits, and that Audrey, raised in the reserve of Dutch aristocracy and English boarding schools, found genuinely wounding. Luca was a child watching this, not old enough to contextualize it, old enough to feel it. The dinners that ended without explanation, the mornings with a particular quality of quiet, the way his mother's composure, always her most reliable armour, occasionally showed its seams. He was 12 when the divorce was finalised, in 1982. Andrea Dotti did not vanish from his life. Luca has described a continuing relationship with his father that was affectionate, if irregular. But the household restructured around absence in ways that left marks. Sean was 22 by then, already essentially launched into adult life. Luca was the child at home, the one who had to negotiate the new geography of his parents' separation while still in school, still needing people to stay. Audrey moved more fluidly between Rome and Tolochenaz after the divorce, and Luca travelled with her. He attended schools in Switzerland and Italy, developing the bilingualism that would later characterise both his personal and professional life. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a troubled adolescent in any visible way. He was quiet, he was observant. He was, by temperament, the kind of person who processes inward rather than outward, the opposite of the scrutiny his family name attracted, and perhaps because of it. He studied graphic design. This matters in ways people tend to skip past. Graphic design is a discipline about the relationship between image and meaning, about how the thing you see shapes the thing you feel about it. Luca Dotti, the son of the most photographed woman of the 20th century, chose a career built on the question of how images work. Whether that is coincidence or something more deliberate is impossible to say. He has never said. But the choice sits there, asking its own question. He built a career in Rome, working as a graphic designer across commercial and editorial projects. He kept his professional life separate from the Hepburn machinery in a way that required ongoing effort. His last name is Dotti, not Hepburn, not Ferrer, and he has consistently declined to position himself primarily as his mother's son. He is his mother's son. He is also a working designer in a city he has chosen to live in, and the distinction appears to matter to him. His personal life has included marriage. He has children, sons, whose names he has kept largely out of public circulation, in a privacy that feels protective rather than evasive. Audrey cared, deeply and specifically about her grandchildren. Luca has spoken about the way she was with children in her final years, with his sons, with Sean's daughter, with the children she visited in her UNICEF work, with a tenderness that suggests he carries that image carefully. She never met all of the grandchildren who would come later. She was gone at 63, and some of what she would have been to them exists only in the stories her sons tell. His father, Andrea Dotti, died in Rome on January 25, 2007. He was 64 years old. The cause was a heart attack. The death received modest coverage. Andrea Dotti was known primarily as Audrey Hepburn's second husband, a designation that followed him through his life and ultimately into his obituaries. Luca's grief at his father's death was private. He did not speak about it publicly. What it meant to lose his father 14 years after losing his mother, to be at 37 without either parent, is something he has kept entirely to himself. Then, in 2015, he published a book. This requires attention. Audrey at Home, Memories of My Mother's Kitchen, is not, at first glance, an obvious act of intimacy from a man who has spent his adult life maintaining distance from the Hepburn industry. It is a cookbook, organised by season, illustrated with family photographs from the La Paisible archive, annotated with recipes that Audrey actually made, and Luca actually grew up eating: pasta e fagioli, roast chicken, the specific risotto she made for birthdays. The book arrived in the same year as several other Hepburn anniversary publications and stood apart from all of them because it was not about the image. It was about the kitchen floor. It was about the smell of the house on Sunday afternoons. It was, in the most specific possible terms, a record of being mothered by her. Luca wrote in the introduction that cooking was his mother's most private act of love. The sentence has been quoted widely enough to suggest it hit something true. What it describes is a woman who expressed in food what she could not always express in speech. The anxiety of having been a hungry child transformed into the need to ensure that the people she loved were fed. Both sons grew up eating well and knowing what that meant. Luca chose to write it down. The book was also, read carefully, an act of differentiation. Sean's book was biography, chronological, documented, the son stepping back to let the subject fill the frame. Luca's book was texture, intimacy, the grain of daily life. Two sons, two entirely different ways of holding on. The contrast is not competitive. It is just honest. They are different people who lost the same woman and found different shapes for the grief. What Luca Dotti is now, at 55, is this: a graphic designer in Rome, a father, a man who wrote one book about his mother and has not sought the spotlight since. His brother manages the foundation. Luca sends his sons to school. He works. He presumably cooks the pasta e fagioli, the roast chicken, the birthday risotto, the recipes that are also memories, the meals that are also the closest thing to having her back at the stove, which is where she was happiest, which is where both of her sons remember her most clearly. He has never given a long interview about his inner life. He has not written a memoir. He has not positioned himself as the keeper of the flame, and yet the book exists, quietly, on shelves. A document of a son who needed to say something about his mother that nobody else could say, said it in the most private language available, and then returned to his life. Some people survive by building monuments. Some survive by cooking the same soup their mother made on a winter evening in Rome, in a kitchen that smells right, with children in the next room. Luca, it seems, is the second kind. There is a pattern in this family that becomes visible only when you stand back far enough to see both stories at once. It is not the pattern people expect. Not addiction, not scandal, not the spectacular unravelling that the children of famous people are supposed to provide. It is quieter than that, and in some ways harder to look at directly. Both sons grew up inside a love that was genuine and total, and occasionally, through no particular fault of anyone, simply unavailable. Audrey Hepburn loved her boys with the specific intensity of a woman who had been abandoned by her own father at 6, who had survived a war by learning to be small and still, who understood at a cellular level that the people you love can disappear. She did not take her children for granted. She took the opposite position. She held them so close that the holding became its own kind of pressure. When she was present, she was entirely present. When she was gone, the absence had weight. Both boys learned to live with that alternation. They learned to be self-sufficient in the gaps and grateful in the moments of closeness. And they carried that training into adulthood in the way children always carry the emotional grammar of their households. Not as a conscious choice, but as the only language they knew. Sean carried it into public life, into the foundation work, the book, the interviews where he chooses his words with the care of someone who has been thinking about them for 30 years. He has said, in various forms across various years, that his mother's greatest gift was making him feel seen. She had a way, he told one interviewer, of looking at you as if you were the only thing in the room that mattered. The son of a woman the entire world was looking at, describing the experience of being looked at only by her. The private child inside the public story, still reaching for that specific quality of attention. Luca carried it into the kitchen, into the cookbook that is also a record of presence. Here is what she made. Here is how she made it. Here is the evidence that she was here. His book is structured around seasons, which is another way of saying it is structured around time. The way time in a kitchen with someone you love is different from other time. Slower, more specific, the kind you can return to if you have the right recipe and the right afternoon. He wrote, simply, that food was how she showed up. She cooked for us the way other mothers might have said, "I love you," constantly, practically, with her whole attention. The man who processes, inward, expressing it in the most grounded language available, not the image, the meal. What both of them received and what both of them have spent their adult lives working with is this: the knowledge that they were the most important people in the world to someone the world could not stop watching. That is not nothing. It is also not uncomplicated. It means growing up with a baseline of being loved that most people never have. And simultaneously growing up in the awareness that the love exists inside a frame you did not choose and cannot remove. You are Sean Hepburn Ferrer. You are Luca Dotti. You are also, always, her sons. The map was drawn before you arrived. Neither of them has spent their public life performing that complexity. Neither has given the interview that cracks open the private story and lets strangers walk through it. Sean came closest with his book, and even that was careful, full of love, specific about memory, deliberately quiet about damage. Luca's book barely mentions grief at all. It is entirely about presence. That too is a kind of survival strategy, and not a lesser one. What they inherited was not just an estate or a foundation or a face that reappears in their daughters and their mirrors. They inherited the task of being the children of someone irreplaceable, in a world that never stops reminding them of that fact, without a map for how to do it with dignity and without disappearing. They both, in their different ways, managed it. Sean outward, Luca inward. Sean in airports and press rooms and UNICEF correspondence. Luca in Rome on a Tuesday, teaching his sons to make the risotto the way she made it, which is to say, the way her mother maybe made it, which is to say, the way grief sometimes moves forward. In small, careful acts, in the kitchen, by hand. On the morning of January 19th, 1993, the day before she died, Audrey Hepburn was still awake. Robert Walders, who had been her companion since 1980, and who was, by the accounts of everyone who saw them together, the quietest and most constant love of her adult life, was with her. Both sons were close. The house was doing what La Paisible always did in winter, holding the cold at a distance, the garden bare and formal through the windows, the interior warm in the specific way of old Swiss houses, with thick walls and deep windowsills. She had been home from Houston for less than a month. The surgery had confirmed what the doctors had suspected since the previous autumn. Peritoneal mesothelioma, rare, aggressive, already advanced when they found it. She had wanted to come home because she was, at her deepest level, a person who understood the importance of place. La Paisible had been her anchor for 30 years. It was where she had planted the roses herself, dug in with her own hands, in the mornings before anyone else was awake. It was where she had made the pasta on the kitchen floor. It was where, in the logic of her life, the ending made sense. Wolders has described her final hours with a restraint that honours what they were. She was peaceful. She was not in extraordinary pain. She was aware of the people in the room. She died in the early hours of January 20th, a Wednesday, as the village was still dark and the garden was still frozen, and the century that had made her famous still had 7 years left to run. Her estate was valued at approximately $37 million at the time of probate, held across Swiss accounts, property interests, and the personal archive. The photographs, the correspondence, the Givenchy pieces she had kept. La Paisible passed to her sons. The question of how to manage the Audrey Hepburn name and image commercially, a question that would become increasingly complex as the decades passed, and the technology for licensing a dead celebrity's likeness evolved past anything anyone had imagined in 1993, became essentially Sean's domain, managed through the Audrey Hepburn estate and the foundation that carries her name. The estate has been protective by the standards of celebrity estates. They have said no to things that other estates have said yes to. When a 2023 artificial intelligence commercial used a reconstructed version of Audrey Hepburn to sell Galaxy chocolate in the UK, a campaign that had actually been approved before her death but was revisited using updated AI technology to refresh the footage, Sean spoke publicly about the ethics of the decision with a discomfort that suggested the family's ongoing negotiations between honouring her legacy and controlling its distortion are not simple or comfortable. He did not frame it as outrage. He framed it as a question without a clean answer. That measured register, that refusal of the easy emotional position, is very much his mother's son. Audrey Hepburn's grandchildren, Emma Ferrer, Luca's sons, whose names he keeps close, are now in their 30s and 20s. Emma, 39, has built a life that is deliberately not the one that 2014 Harper's Bazaar cover suggested she might. She is an actress, a visual artist, a person who carries her grandmother's face in hers and appears to have made a kind of peace with that, or at least a workable arrangement. She has said that her grandmother is present in her life, not as a ghost or a burden, but as something she moves through them, world alongside. Luca's sons are private in the way their father is private. They are growing up in Rome. They are learning, presumably, the risotto. The foundation Audrey began, and Sean continued, has operated for more than 30 years in the communities she visited in her final years. Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Guatemala, Honduras, Bangladesh. It has built wells, funded vaccinations, supported schools. The work is not glamorous in the way her career was glamorous. It is the opposite, specific, unglamorous, done in places where her name is not the point, and the need is simply the need. She wanted that. Sean has made sure she got it. January 20th, 1993, Tolochenaz, Switzerland. The village has not yet woken up. 2 sons nearby, the garden frozen outside the window of La Paisible. The house quiet in the way that houses are quiet when someone has stopped fighting. They knew who she was to the world. They had always known. They had grown up inside the gap between the image and the woman, the cheekbones and the Givenchy and the doe eyes in every magazine, and then the kitchen floor, the pasta, the breakfast tray, the note on the table when she wasn't there, the feeling of being The most important thing in a room that the whole world wanted to enter. She left them without a map. She left them with everything else she had: the discipline, the composure, the capacity to love completely without making a performance of it. The knowledge that survival is not dramatic. It is the roast chicken on Sunday, the foundation meeting on Tuesday, the granddaughter in the mirror, the son in Rome teaching his sons her recipes, the other son on a plane somewhere, carrying her name into a place where children are hungry in the specific way she once was hungry, in the winter, when she was 15, before anyone knew her face. She was loved. She loved. Something remains. The sons are still here.